Welcome back. I hope everyone had a meaningful Shabbat and are doing your best to stay positive no matter what's going on. Let's start this evening with a story. The story begins with the third Chabad Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. So the founder of Chabad, some 250 years ago, was the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe known as the Old Rebbe, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi. The third Rebbe was his grandson, son of his daughter Dvorah. Well, because his mother Dvorah died young, the third Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch, was raised by his grandfather, the first Rebbe, in his home. That yields some interesting stories for us to discuss about his childhood. And this particular story is related to the Torah portion of this week, the Torah portion of Vayikra. Because when the Tzemach Tzedek, when this little boy, future third Rebbe of Chabad, was only 3 years old, he was taken for his first Torah lesson. And at his first Torah lesson, he was shown the first verse of this week's portion, Vayikra. And the verse reads, Vayikra el Moshe, and God called out to Moshe by Oyel Moed from the sanctuary, from the tent of meeting, meaning the temple, the temporary temple that the Jews had in the desert, and called him forth to teach him the law. But that word, Vayikra, which means and God called out, is written strangely in the fact that out of all of its letters, the last letter, the Aleph, is written smaller than the rest. So the regular letters all appear in their size, and throughout the Torah you have, in a few individual occasions, either a letter larger than the margin or smaller than the margin. This particular Aleph is smaller than the margin. So the third Rebbe, the little boy, asks his grandfather, why is this letter smaller? Vayikra, he recognized the Aleph. Why is the Aleph smaller than all the other letters on the line? And his grandfather explained that that small Aleph represents the humility of Moshe, of Moses, our first teacher, the first Jewish leader. Represents that although he was leading the Jewish people and teaching them the Torah as taught to him by God himself, he remained humble no matter what. In fact, Moshe is known in the Torah as the most humble person ever to have lived. Now, of course, the question is, how does someone like Moses remain humble in spite of his obvious greatness? I mean, Moshe wasn't some deluded individual who didn't appreciate the greatness that he had to offer. Obviously, the leader of the people who will soon celebrate Passover, who brought the 10 plagues upon Egypt, who conducted this whole campaign against Pharaoh, the mightiest ruler of that time, took the Jewish people out of Egypt through the sea, and finally, with the teaching of the Torah from God himself to the Jewish people, and led the Jewish people for 40 years, obviously was a great man. How is it that he remained so humble in his spirit and in his self-image? Well, Hasidic teachings explain that Moshe was humble because of his attitude. Moshe understood and appreciated his greatness. He knew who he was and what he had to offer. He knew how much he made this world a better place and how much he had taught and brought and gifted us all with. There was no mistake there. However, Moshe also appreciated that those were gifts from God, that all these things that he had accomplished were gifts gifted to him by God, giving him to do everything that he had done and to accomplish all these great things. And he thought to himself, had God given these gifts to another individual, perhaps that individual would achieve even more. So instead of becoming haughty and conceited and full of a sense of self-worth, and there is none greater than I am Moses himself, he appreciated that actually these are all gifts from God. God had given him the talents, given him the abilities, chosen him for the role, and he thought to himself, had God chosen someone else, perhaps that someone else would make even greater use of these gifts. That's an important lesson in our own attitudes. When we talk about humility, we talk about appreciating the greatness of others. We talk about appreciating that we are not necessarily the be-all, end-all, and we shouldn't be overly full of a sense of haughtiness and self-worth. And obviously, nobody can stand such a person. That doesn't mean that we don't appreciate what we have to offer. That doesn't mean we don't appreciate our gifts and our talents. But that does mean that we recognize those are gifts from God for us to use. And we're appreciating those gifts. We should try to bring them to their full potential. And always remember that had someone else had those gifts, perhaps they'd go a step further than we did. So instead of letting it blow us up and become haughty and too much to handle, we remain humble, we remain appreciative of the gifts we were given, and we use them for what they should be used. What's key here in the case of Moshe and the teaching regarding that small aleph, that small letter when Moshe was called forth by God, is that Moshe was humble, and without this humility, he could not be the Moshe that he was. Now, what does that mean? Moshe's humility was key and critical to his leadership of the Jewish people and to his teaching the Torah to the Jewish people. Anytime you have a teacher and a student, it will be important for the student to be humble, to be willing to listen, to be willing to appreciate what the student has to offer, what the teacher has to offer. When the student comes to class thinking he already knows it all, and why bother, and perhaps he can even outsmart the teacher, such a student cannot succeed. Such a student will not apply himself. Such a student will not allow the message to be absorbed. Such a student will not focus. Such a student believes he's already done. He's got it all made. So obviously, in every teacher-student setting, the student has to come with the humility, the acceptance to hear and listen. What is the teacher going to say? And only then to think it over and ask questions or perhaps contribute his own ideas. But if the student were ready to come to class, come to the table, already knowing it all, well, it's difficult to make any progress from there. Obviously, when God himself is your teacher, that is even more so. If God himself is the teacher, as in the case of Moshe, Moshe would need that humility to accept the message from God and to truly allow that to sink in. Moshe approached every lesson that God taught him, every time he had this divine communication in this unique way, with that humility, appreciating that it's time to put his own ideas aside and first listen and appreciate what he was being taught. Now, in other words, and perhaps taking this all a step deeper, how can a human being ever absorb a divine message? I mean, God doesn't usually speak to us, and that's because it's not our language or our type of communication. It's not something we know how to appreciate or to handle. What does it mean for a human to appreciate a God's message? It's just not on our wavelength. The infinite God, how would we appreciate, how would we understand, how would we absorb the message of the infinite God? Well, there's only one way to make this work, and this is expressed in something interesting. Have you ever wondered, I'm sure some of you have you ever wondered, what does the name Chabad mean? So the Chabad movement is called Chabad. Now, what does that name mean? Of course, when people hear the term Chabad or the Chabad movement, they might think a lot of things. They might think of the acceptance, how Chabad famously accepts every Jew. They might think of going an extra mile to reach every Jew. They might think of Hasidic Judaism. They might think of the commitment. There's a lot of things that Chabad is famous for today. But what does that term actually mean? And where did it come from? So the term Chabad is an acronym for the 3 steps of the intellectual process. Why the emphasis on the intellectual process? Because the gift that Chabad brought to Hasidism, which preceded it, the gift that Chabad brings to the Hasidic movement, and the novelty that it adds to it, is that the ideas, these fundamental life-changing ideas that exist in Hasidism and Jewish mysticism, should be applied, should be absorbed, and should truly be brought home. And in order to do that, we need to intellectually understand and appreciate the message. If we'd study the Torah, and we'd study particularly the mystical ideas of the Torah, the teachings of Hasidism, and not take the time and the effort to truly understand, to truly appreciate, to truly intellectually absorb that all, that doesn't become a part of who we are. For these life-changing ideas to really exercise their potential, we really need to allow them to sink in and to become what they could be as a part of us. So that's the idea of the intellectual emphasis in Chabad, and the full discussion of it is for another time. But the actual acronym spells out 3 points of the intellectual process. And that's in Hebrew, Chokhmah, Binah, and Dat, which is Chet, Bet, and Dalet, spelling out Chabad, Chet, Bet, and Dalet, Chokhmah, Binah, and Dat. These 3 terms, Chokhmah would mean wisdom, Binah would be understanding, and finally, number 3, Dat, knowledge. Now, what's the difference? And what is the definition of these 3 terms, Chokhmah, Binah, and Dat, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge? How do they differ from each other? It sounds like all of the same thing. But actually, breaking it down, we think about how our brains work. If we ever take the time to do that, we'll understand that wisdom, Chokhmah, means a new idea. Everything starts from an idea. Everything starts from a germ, from a kernel, from a starting point, from something really small, from an idea, from just something that's out there, something that we'll start with and have to develop. That's Chokhmah. That's the first flash of inspiration. I had this wonderful idea. I had this thought. Now I want to do something with it. Binah, meaning understanding, is where we take that thought apart and we try to truly absorb and understand what's going on here. What is this thought? What does this idea mean? What is its potential? What does it not mean? We cross-examine it and we squeeze it out for all it's worth. Many ideas fail at that point in the process. Binah, understanding, is what you might call comprehension. Truly rigorously testing and cross-checking the idea until we really get to what it really has to offer. And finally, Dat is the bottom line, the conclusion, the end message, the end result that we reached after starting with a new idea, developing it through the Binah, through the understanding. Dat, meaning knowledge, is where we end up after all that. Now, you might ask a great question, and that is, I understand how our intellect process the Binah, the understanding, the comprehension, the questions and answers, the cross-examination of the idea, and I understand how we reach a bottom line. But where does the idea even come from? What does Chokhmah mean? How do I decide I want a new idea now? Where do I get the new idea from? Many people are challenged by this. In fact, some people are better at analysis and cross-examination and testing something as opposed to coming up with a new idea to begin with. But obviously, we all do come up with new ideas. And obviously, there are some people who come up with a lot of great new ideas. So where does it come from? How do we get a new idea that we previously did not have? How does it pop into our heads? The answer, as Hasidism teaches us, is it comes from nowhere. From nowhere. Now, what does nowhere mean? Nowhere means beyond me, not a part of me. It doesn't come from within me. My capability to understand, to discuss, to examine, to question, to answer, and to reach a conclusion is part of my intellectual capability. But new ideas are gifts. New ideas don't come from inside of me. A new idea has to be granted to my brain. Now, how does that happen? Sometimes we encounter an idea, we encounter inspiration. Someone says something, we notice something, we pick up on a thought, we pick up on a spark, and that's where our idea begins. But at other times, it does come from within our own minds. At other times, we do come up with a new idea seemingly from nowhere. When does that happen? When does a new inspiration come into my mind from nowhere? When we reach nowhere, when we reach a dead end. If we're stuck at a problem, if we're thinking deeply and we can't solve it, and we keep trying, we just don't get there till we kind of get stuck and say, I don't know. That's where a new idea can hopefully come in. When I say, I don't know what to do here. I don't know how to solve this. I don't know how to address this. I don't know how to move forward. I'm saying I abandon my previous mindset. I abandon my self construct. I abandon my box, as it were, which limits me to one specific approach or limits me to a certain set of rules in my own mind, in my own self definition of how I'm going to go through this. And I say, that's not working. At that point, we're allowing new mindsets, new thinking processes, new ideas to come in. Letting go, essentially, of myself, letting go of where I am up to and where I'm stuck allows me to accept something beyond myself. That's chachma. That's wisdom. That's a new idea entering the human psyche. That new idea comes from a place beyond me, higher than me, greater than me, and happens when I let go enough to be able to accept that. That's why in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, we see wisdom, we see chachma, we see that part of the human intellect as the entry point for the divine. We all have godliness inside of us. We all have a soul inside of us. We all have that higher spark inside of us that bonds with us, that finds its entry into who we are at the point of chachma, at the point of wisdom, at the point where we say, I don't know, I need a new idea, I need a new inspiration. I don't have the answer. I accept my limitation. Then we accept something greater than ourselves. In other words, if the human being will always be caught up with his own capabilities and his own mindset and his own self-image and his own approach and his own attitude, there's no room to accept that which is greater, that which is beyond, that which is divine. But when I say, I don't know, when I say, I need the help here, when I am humble about it, I allow my own blockages to retreat and the higher idea to arrive. In Talmudic terminology, this is expressed with a very simple analogy. A glass of water cannot accept more water if the glass is full. An empty glass can be filled with water. If we approach an idea, if we approach our relationship with God, if we approach our relationship with a text of the Torah we're trying to study as a full glass, that we already have the answers and we already know, well, at that point, we're not able to accept a new idea, something greater than what we already know. But if we come as an empty glass, we come and say, there is plenty that I do not know. There is something missing from my glass. Now we can accept new, greater, and higher. Now, of course, just having an empty glass will not give me anything. I have lots of empty glasses and they stay empty. The empty glass needs to be in the right place and at the right time. You need the right set of circumstances for an empty glass to fill with water or something else valuable. A full glass can't handle anything added. An empty glass can, but only in the right set of circumstances. So let's look at what the right set of circumstances mean using this illustration. The illustration we have here is the Daled and the Resh. Two Hebrew letters, Daled and Resh. I'm going to turn the camera around so we can all see that. Daled and Resh are two Hebrew letters very similar to each other. That's the Daled and that's the Resh. They're very similar not only in their shape, but they're actually similar in their meaning. Daled is from the Hebrew word dal, which means a pauper, a destitute and poor person. And Resh is the Hebrew word rush, which also means a poverty-stricken individual, a very poor and destitute person. What's the difference between the two? The difference is expressed in that bump that the Daled has that the Resh does not. The Daled extends behind itself, while the Resh does not extend anywhere at all. What does that difference express? They're both paupers. They both need help. They're both stuck. They're both in a challenged situation. But the Daled says, I have a goal, I have a mission, I have the focus, and I will set out to achieve it. The Resh is the one who just gives up and is stuck right there. The Daled has that extra bump behind it expressing its focus and its appreciation for something greater and beyond it. The Reish is missing that. The Reish is just there as a poor person, as a one totally giving up with nothing else to even try, losing that focus, losing that direction of where do we go from here? What's going to be our next attempt? In other words, they're both poor and they're both stuck. They're both empty glasses. But what happens when we're an empty glass? What happens when we're challenged? Some give up or feel bitter, disappointed at the loss of a dream, the loss of a goal, the loss of a vision, and others feel empowered and they say, what does God have in store for me now? Where do we go from here? What can we change going forward? How can I rise up from this poverty-stricken place and achieve? That's the empty glass that's under the spigot, that's ready to receive, that's ready to be filled. So humility, the small aleph of Vayikra, the lesson of Moshe teaches us to be humble, to be ready to accept from greater than us. But we also need to know that we don't stop and give up, but we're ready to move forward. We're ready to achieve, ready to accept, and to give it the effort that we need to give to it. Why is this all important right now? Why is this topic critical? Because it's happening before our eyes. So many of us, essentially all of us, with everything that's been happening and is still happening the past couple of weeks, have lost dreams, have lost goals, have lost plans. Billions of dollars have been wiped out. Unfortunately, lives have been lost. So much has changed, and we do not yet know where this is all going to end. We were truly given a lesson in the limitations of the human being and in the frailty of the human condition. We may think we had it all. We may think we figured it all out. And all of a sudden, a new virus and a new challenge shows us we have plenty left to learn, plenty left to achieve. It's a lesson in humility. It's truly a lesson in our limitations. But here we have two choices. We can be the Reish and raise up our hands in exasperation, feel bitter and disappointed. I had so much planned for these weeks. I had so much invested. I'm losing so much. I don't even know how I'm going to restart, and get lost in that self-pity, in that bitterness or disappointment. That's obviously not the way to go. Our other alternative is to say, God is teaching us something here. God shows us we need to be humble. We need to be ready for what's beyond us. Our cups shouldn't be full of our own self-importance and our own self-ability to achieve. Our cups should be empty, but ready to receive. Our cups have been emptied. We need to come there and say, yes, I'm ready to receive. I'm ready to make this something positive. I'm ready to say, okay, I got the message. I understand we need the humility. I understand it doesn't begin and end with me or even with humankind as a whole, but there's a God beyond it all. I'm ready to hear that message, but I'm not here to give up and say, I was dealt a bad stroke of luck. Look at all of what this caused. I'm here to say, where do we go from here? What's the greater and the higher and the beyond that I meant to achieve, that we're meant to reach, that we're meant to accomplish by all of this destruction and loss along the way? The Hasidic saying, going back many generations, is that after a fire would come and devastate someone's home or business or whatever it was, after a fire, one would become wealthy. Why is that? Because after the loss of me, of what I have, of what I thought I'm going to do, of what I invested and my capabilities, and that suddenly disappears like it's happening right now all around us. When that suddenly disappears, we're ready for greater. We're ready for more. We're ready for a godly expression. We're ready for what God is going to be giving us. We should be able to accept that, go with that, take that, and advance ourselves and advance the world around us to a greater and higher place. So it's up to us. Our cups have been emptied out. The world has been turned upside down. but what's our attitude going to be? Let's take the attitude of the Dalit. Let's take the attitude where we might be paupers, but we have something behind. We have a sense of direction leading us forward, keeping us focused. Tomorrow night, we will begin once again at 8 o'clock, same place, same YouTube and Facebook channels. 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, we will have a Passover class discussing the customs, the mitzvahs, the traditions of Pesach, how we do them right, what do they mean, and finally, tips and solutions for the challenges that this year in particular are throwing in our way in preparing for Passover. Tuesday, as we continue this series of classes, we will have a unique class which will be a question and answer session. So I encourage you to email or comment here or contact me in any other way you prefer with your questions, whatever's been bothering you most, whatever's on your mind on a Jewish topic, and we will do our best to discuss those on Tuesday. So again, we'll see you tomorrow, 8 o'clock, right here. Have a wonderful evening.